So I was talking earlier about how I don't do slide-driven presentations. That's totally just my preference. So I made this slide up about 2 minutes ago on the fly because it's sort of nice to see that this is really just one story that I'm going to tell, and there are 3-story arcs. And so I kind of labeled them as 3 talks. We'll talk about the first one in depth here in a minute. There was a Peep Code video a while back that was called Fire Up Ember.js. And it was a nice little client-side application that lets you pick sort of a table. You can imagine you're picking a table in a restaurant, and then for that table you can add some food items to the order and effectively have the client total this up. And the cool thing about this demo was that it showed a couple of interesting things. The first is, without a database, we don't need to talk about Ajax, backend servers. We don't need to mock any of that for this demo. But we can still do some fun stateful client stuff. Secondly, and I personally think the most important, is it highlighted the URL and the back button. So if you know anything about Ember.js, the Ember community feels very strongly that when I hit the back button, I should just go back to where I was. And when I hit the refresh button, I should just come back to the working app as it was a second ago, minus the statefulness of it here because I don't have any database. So what I thought was cool is I was learning React here fairly recently, and I thought it'd be kind of cool to rebuild the same app just to help me see the differences between Ember and React. I think also I should state like a subtitle for this talk would be Ember.js for the React.js for the Ember developer. My previous experience is all Ember, so if you're going to hear me talk about the Ember router a lot, I'm sorry. The second part of the talk is once we get Fire Up Ember as React, we're going to jump in and actually drive it all out of an inline index HTML and then do a bulk build, talk about ES6 modules, how we transpile those, sort of make it more of a production-ready app. Because what you're going to see in the first section is we're going to have everything in line, which a lot of times when you read these demos, you go, well, Toran, that's great, but I wouldn't ship this to production in one file in the index.html, so how do I do it production-ish friendly, so a refactor. And then thirdly is after the refactor, we're going to use this newer technology called JSPM, and it's actually sort of React agnostic. You can do this with Ember, Angular, anything you want. But what I love about JSPM is it's going to let me fetch an entire module or actually an entire bundle. You can think of it as it lets you componentize your application so that if you have your main application and you want that in its own build with its own Git repo and its own tests, you can also have like your reporting application in its own repo with its own tests and then still reference it from the main app, pulling in that bundle only when you need it. So for one, you can shorten your sort of overall build size. And secondly, just for maintainability, I want these in separate repos with their own test builds or own Jenkins builds. So that's going to be Arc, and I'm going to try and do it as much freehand as I can. I'm really only going to copy paste one build HTML because it's going to get a bit tedious. I'm also going to show a little foundation, so if you're a Twitter Bootstrap person, don't worry. There's only about 3 minutes of foundation demo tutorial in this. The entire talk is going to be very tutorial example driven, so if you're looking for slides about lessons learned, that's probably what you won't see today, and my feelings would not be hurt if you guys left. So without further ado, let's write out our index HTML here. And I'm just going to have a really simple script, and you can imagine if we're going to build this with React, how's the coloring back there? Is that blue? Good, bad? Good? It's iffy?
You can do white back.
So I'll do white. I'll do... that is not... I can try white. That did not go right. So this is where the demo falls down. Too dark. Think about that. Okay, how about we start typing some text and see if Pam is totally excellable or not. So if I'm going to actually use React, I need to pull in a valid components. React.
Just like a set syntax or set color. That's what
What color do you want here? I'm afraid I don't know what other colors are going to do. Honeyback. Is that a white one? Okay, it's white-ish. Is that better? It's got some white text. Okay. Good call, stuff. All right. Saves the demo. Honey Badger. So first I have to start with React.js. It just makes sense. React, the nice thing if you're a big React fanboy is we don't have to pull in any additional libraries because it's kind of just the view layer. And if you want to get started, React, if you missed the React talk this morning, I'm going to lightly cover how to create a React component because it's super simple and it's also a good starting point. The way I like to code at work and the way I like to do my demos is just incremental progress. So we're going to start with a really simple component, incrementally get feedback, and then drive it out. So we're going to start out, you can create a React component just by saying tables. That just happens to be the name of it. And then you create the actual component itself by saying create class. And inside here, the cool thing about React is there's really only one method you need to override, and it's called render. It's just a vanilla JavaScript function. And this is where it gets a little nasty, and I will ask you please not to walk out, because what you're about to see is probably the ugliest thing, and I'll admit, as someone who's sort of just playing around with React, that this was the first thing that turned me off of the library. And that is, if I want to actually return something from here at first, without any special HTML templating, the actual syntax for this is very verbose. It's react.dom.div, and then I'm not going to give it any attributes like an ID or a class, because all I wanted to do was print out a simple div that says hello world. So we're going to come back and iterate, but that's the first step in the React demo here. And then if we want to, of course, take this demo or this component and then render it onto the screen, we need to tell React to render component. And then all you pass render component is an instance of that React component, and then where you want to get started. So we're going to say document.body. We'll flip back to the working demo directory here. Now I have hello world. So we had nothing ready to go, great. But if you're new to React and you're just here to check out what React is like, and you're looking at this piece of syntax, this is terrible. I would never want to write anything in this, because for me as a web developer, I like HTML for content, CSS for styling, JavaScript for behavior. So let's see what we can do in the React world. They have this idea that lets you write HTML, and it's called JSX. So we're going to use an inline JSX transformer just for a little bit, because we have to have something to kind of transform this on the fly for us. And then to actually use this inline in the script tag, we have to change the type to text JSX. And then finally, third concession here, we have to give this JSX react.dom declaration. And now the nice thing is I can actually return div hello Toran. So I don't know about you, but I'm already feeling a little bit better. So we can iterate, and I change the text. So instead of hello world, hello Toran. Now this isn't anywhere close to the fire up Ember.js demo, so let's introduce Foundation. And if you're not familiar with Foundation, all I'm going to use is the grid system here. Let's sort of scaffold out the 12-column grid. If you haven't seen that, it's super basic in Foundation, which is why I chose to use it here. So we need a link, and the first thing we need in the link is just the CSS, which I've already included. And I've got Foundation CSS, and I've got a couple app-specific CSS styles. And the next thing we want to do is sort of talk about, in little web apps, I would just have all my markup in line. But what happens behind the scenes is this div, as it looks like regular HTML today, is going to be transformed into a JavaScript function. It's rendered in the browser. So the trade-off here is that I can only have sort of one parent element or function coming out. Everything else will need to be nested inside of it. So what does that mean in code? That means, that means I need to only have sort of a top-level div coming out, and then everything else will have to be nested inside of it. So here I'm going to use the React grid system, and all we're going to do is basically scaffold out what you would normally see as the HTML inside here. The first change, though, is in normal HTML, I would say div class is row, and you guys wouldn't think anything different of it. The problem is this class word is not very friendly for JSX. So we have to make our first concession here and use a special keyword called class name. So already, if you have a designer on the team or someone who's more into markup and styling, we're probably mad at you. But this is really the only concession we'll make in this demo today, so bear with me. The next thing we'll do is I need to create sort of the 12-column layout. And again, what we're trying to achieve, just to kind of give everyone a heads up here, is we're just trying to achieve the basic left side of this for right now with some super basic styles. And I can do that by starting out with a class name of 12 rows, because that first one I want to go all the way across the top. 12 rows. If you're already hating this CSS tutorial, just hang in there. It'll be over soon. So inside here, we're just going to have an H1 that has a misspelled order. Does anyone know why they misspelled order?
It's a startup.
It's a startup. Well, you get the IO and all that jazz. Okay. 12. 12 is not spelled right. Where's JS Hint when you need it, right? Alright. So next we're going to do this kind of the left side, which is 4 columns, and how we do that.
Does it work when you have JSX page? Is there a JSPM alternative? JSX?
Good question. I actually have to turn all that off in my JSX because it complains. I don't have a good linter right now. So inside here we're going to do a class of 12 because that's how we kind of restart. You can think of us restarting the grid system every time we come into a row. And for this one, my left column is just going to have the tables themselves, and that's just going to give us 4 columns. So we'll say 4, spelled correctly right hand. 4 columns. And then the other side of it, you can imagine, is going to be 8 columns. And the only thing special really inside the 4 is we have an H2 that says the word tables, and then we have an anchor tag that we'll kind of leave dead for now with some special styles. Panel, 6 columns, and now I think I can zoom out a little bit here. Alright, maybe a little more up here. Alright, so we'll do 6 columns, and then I'll just give this, what, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these guys, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Now in the bottom 8, right now we're just going to put a placeholder and just put an H2 that says please select the table, something fun like that. And now if we refresh our app, we should get everything except I'm missing, I think, a style on these divs. So this div actually has an ID of order, and this div has an ID of tables. Alright, I don't know if I have completely broken that style. Sorry, what's that? Columns. Oh my gosh, which columns did I break?
Panel 6 columns.
Oh, look at that.
You can column edit the column type.
COLUMNS, right? Alright, there we go. Not completely broken. Okay. So we're getting started. So the next piece is on the right side. If I was doing normal React without this sort of router business that we're going to dive into, I would have to compose another component or just inline all the HTML itself. So we're going to start out just composing it because I think composing components is still valuable, just not in this demo, but we'll start out and refactor it out. So how I do that is instead of please select a table down here, we can literally just inline say, go render this table component. And so this line right here basically tells React go render this other component. And up here we'll just create another React component called table individually. And just to get started again, just to get some feedback, we'll say just render me a hello world in here. Inside the component, something like that. And so it's really tiny because we don't have an H2 or an H1 in there. But so far, what I've seen is that we can compose these things together. And to save everyone mistyping columns 9 times again here, I'm just going to copy and paste some HTML in here that is essentially the same foundation tutorial we just went over. So I won't bore you guys with that again. All right, we can't talk about it a little bit. It's really just what you'd expect from the other side, which is we have another row. Because the right side of this has basically 2 split columns, one that has all these anchor tags, which is really just an image for pizza, fries, hot dog, pancakes. And then on the other side, we sort of have just a place to total up the order, right? Basic stuff. And we go back here. It's looking better. So essentially I just skipped out the foundation, but you guys get the picture. So now the biggest problem I'm presenting with here is that I don't want to show table number 1 right away. The whole point was when I select table 1, then I dynamically show it. So if you guys are familiar with the Ember router, it has this outlet idea, which would basically mean that this is a dynamic place that I can insert a sub-template. And we can't do that at all right now. And that's actually the biggest reason when React came out, I just didn't see the appeal. I didn't know how you would eventually construct these applications. I felt like they'd be a bunch of tags soup. But React Router to the Rescue, which is a project by Michael Jackson and Ryan Florence, heavily inspired by the Ember router. So you'll see in a minute, actually, as an Ember developer, I feel very at home writing React now. The first trick is down here at the bottom, and make some space here, where we would normally tell React, go ahead and render some sort of starting component, which we just had tables here. Now we're going to actually bring the router in. The router is going to be the heart and soul of this application. Similar to if you've ever built anything with Ember, you sort of start with the routes first. So let's start out here, and of course, in the script tile up top, I'll include the React router. But I'm going to need a couple of imports that I'm just going to alias. The first is going to be called routes. So we'll say React router.routes. And then the second one will be just route, which is kind of a singular. And then thirdly is something we're going to use called link. And you can think link as really just a glorified anchor tag that is router aware. So you can link to certain places. It will wire up all the anchor tag, normal anchor tag stuff for you. Next, we need to actually just declare the router itself. I'm going to put some white space down here so we can actually show this. Okay, size okay for everybody? I kind of landed zooming in and out of this to have a little bit of HTML. I can zoom in one time here. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create this thing. I'm going to call it a router. That's the name I equate this with. So inside here, you can basically have this parent routes type here. And within there, you just declare individual routes. And those routes can be nested, just like an Ember. How you actually wire them up is you just tell the router, hey, which React component should handle this? So for the very first route, we're just going to tell it, hand that off to tables. And then since selecting an individual table is actually sort of a child, we're going to just push inside a route another route. And you can imagine the handler for this one is just going to be the individual React component table. And there's a couple of individual things we can add to this. We can also give it a name, which kind of helps when we link to it. So I just give it a name of table. And then the most important parameter is actually the path itself. And this is where you can actually dynamically declare what will the browser render the URL when the person transforms to this. So I'm just going to call it table. And then you use this colon syntax, and then whatever table ID, when you use whatever variable you want. So I just did colon table underscore ID. And this can be anything you want. There could probably be some convention work in the future, but for right now, it's just kind of a variable that gets dropped in. And what's going to happen is when React actually creates this table component for me, when I click in, it will basically just provide this property, so we can do whatever we want with it. Imagine when we come into this component, we know and we want to know we're using table 1, so we wire it up appropriately. So now we haven't swapped out the very last piece, which is down here. I'm using tables as an instance. And instead now I need to say the router is where we get started. And the only real difference in syntax is I'm not creating an instance of router as we did previously. So we've written a lot of code. I haven't gotten any feedback. My manager's breathing over my neck. So, and of course React router not defined. There we go. So I'm just going to bring this script in. And you can barrel install this now. I'm just kind of saving the bandwidth by getting this done ahead of time. So I'll do this React router.js. Now we come out here, really busted something up inside React router. So React router. There we go. So apparently order dependent, because I'm not doing any common.js or module stuff. You've got to have React.js before React router. So, but on the plus side, we didn't break anything. Now the only weird thing is I'm still rendering this, and I haven't transitioned to that route. So we need to change that. We shouldn't be transitioning here at all. So I'm going to go down to the tables render method, and then down here at the bottom, instead of just showing table as a component, remember I don't want to be in control of this tag soup at all. I want to let the router determine which components are shown when. So I'm just going to rip this out completely and use kind of a special property that the React router gives me called this.props.activeRouteHandler. And that's basically going to drop in any dynamic. If I'm transitioned to any dynamic child route, it will just drop that template right in line, which is what we want. But if it is not there, meaning it's the first time, I'm just going to do an OR statement over here in JavaScript and just call some function to return some HTML. So I'll say OR this.placeholder, and I'll just basically declare a placeholder up here as a method. So we'll say placeholder is a function. And the weirdest part about this whole JSX stuff is I'm literally returning an unquoted H2. This just looks so weird. And I'm going to say, please select the table. So if you're thinking this is weird and that I'm trying to sell you on this, I'm actually not sold on React myself. So this is just a learning process. I'm just hoping to pass on what I've learned in the last 3 months. So if it's a little weird, you're not alone. So now the trick is do this little active route handler work that I put here at the bottom, and we'll show the placeholder automatically. So if I go back out to localhost 3000, I get my placeholder, so that's a start. Now when I click 1, you'll notice that I just have an ampersand because we have that kind of hard-coded broken anchor tag. We need to plug in this link helper. So let's show how to construct that link. The first is I'm going to drop down here and just kind of write it in line so we can see what I'm relating this to. And if you remember, link, the whole point of link is it needs to know how to construct an anchor tag that can load up table. So all we're going to do is say link, and we're going to say 2 equals table, because that's the actual route we're going to go to. And then table underscore ID is literally just a variable, anything I want it to be, and I'm just going to put the number 1. And that's literally it. So as far as the React router, what we need to do is fire up Ember.js sort of parity. This is it. I create a link to, and I have one nested route. Pretty simple. So let's take this up where I actually have an anchor tag. There we go. And I'm just going to drop this in and sort of replace the first one. Remember, we're just kind of iterating, so I don't need to have all of these set up right out of the gate. And of course, I missed my class. You can also pass these CSS styles all the way through the React component. So I'll say panel 6 COLUNS. There you go. So now when I come back out here, my styling is good, but more importantly than that, in really tiny text, it says localhost 2000/table/1. And that was all taken care of by the loop2 helper. So when I click this on the right, and not only is the right filled in, of course, with all that's pretty much static HTML at this point, but the URL has changed. So what about that back button? The back button works. What about the forward button? The forward button works. So as far as breaking the web, I think we're being a good citizen at this point. I think there was a talk this morning, actually, Trek was talking about please don't break the web. So for React developers, I feel like this is a large step forward because the back button works as you'd expect in any non-JavaScript web application. So one step forward. Now the first step is, you know, for the fact that I hard-coded this 1, and what do we do to dynamically change that to whatever table we're on? So I can see the URL on table 1. If I want to change that, I can just plug in a certain property that comes all the way through, and that is, if we go back up here, so instead of this identifier being a hard-coded 1, I can just plug in this.props.params. Whatever name I gave it in the router, and that was table ID. So basically I'm saying dynamically inject. This, if you guys are familiar with handlebars, underscore, other templating languages, same sort of thing is happening here. Like we just put these single squigglies and then inside there any property or state that's on the React component. So now, of course, if I go back out here and I click on 1, we already had a 1. So the thing missing is I need to wire up all the rest of these. And there's basically 2 ways we can do this. This is sort of where opinions get a little crazy, and I don't want to upset anyone. So I'll mention it as an opinion, but if you don't like what we're about ready to do is we're about ready to duplicate all the same styles and essentially everything over there. Again, you can dynamically create something called links, and then dynamically inject it right here using squiggly syntax and say links. So if I want to create this links, it's just vanilla JavaScript. I'll just say links is, for this one, we're just going to create a tables, kind of a tables array, map over that, and create basically a new list of link objects. So it just kind of lets us keep the HTML dry. And if you hate HTML being dry, then don't do this. That's totally cool. So I'm going to do the same class name, which is the whole purpose. Pretty much the same everything. The only things that are going to change is table ID and the actual value. So I can dynamically say, since I'm looping over this, I have table ID. And of course I have table.id, which is, I could put a name in there, but they're the same thing. Now what I can do is I can get rid of all those 6. And I've sort of like cleaned up the HTML in a sense. And the only thing really missing is I need this tables array that I promised I put in here. And then right now it's just going to start out really basic. And we're going to expand upon it in just a bit. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And increment those. Okay. So now we've got 6 tables. And effectively the success for this would be that I can come back out here and I can actually navigate around all 6 tables. So start out with table 1, table 2, table 3. So we're able to bounce around. You also notice the URL is changing, and of course the URL is now driving that identifier in the little black box up there. So as far as the dynamic nature of it, we've got this working. Now the next thing is, if I'm looking at the structure on the right side, I'm using this to actually sort of track state, right? The table, if you look at the right side component, the whole point of this is to track the orders for this table. But we haven't set up any kind of state yet in the table component. So let's drop back into the table component here. And I don't know how deeply it was covered in that previous React talk. I was actually in there, but I remember there's sort of a lifecycle hook in the React component. And one of those is at the beginning of the React component's lifecycle, you can sort of set up some initial state, and it's acceptable to change the state on the object. So, and you can do that yourself, like we're going to, just by saying get initial state. And this is just a function in here. And all you do in this is you can return anything you want to sort of track state on. And in this particular instance, all we're going to do is track the table. So basically what this allows us to do is now inside here, if I console log, I would have this.state.table. And I could do like ID, something like that. So the success of this next iteration is going to be, can I actually set up some state for this component to hold on to? And then if I do, when I drop into the render method, can I accurately spit out the ID? Basic stuff, right? So the first step is I need to actually get the table itself. So I'll just kind of do some formats, JavaScript programming here and say tables.for each function model. And I keep doing this back here. And then once I'm inside here, if the model ID is equal to the table ID, so we'll say table ID, and that's just this props.params.table ID. If that is equal to table ID, I would say table. Oh, yes. Table. I'm sorry? 3 equals. Actually, 3 will fill every other thing. I tried to do the triple. I think one's a string, one's a number. So I just messed up somewhere in the router, but Steph's right. Normally, you only do the triple equals here, but I think one's a string, so I want to coerce it. All right, so now I'm basically just for eaching through the, at the end of the day, what I'm really doing is just enumerating through that sort of tables collection to get the right tables set up. So remember the success criteria, if I save this, is that when I render a particular table, down here in the console, if I blow this up a little bit, when I click on one of these, I should set up the original state and then just have a property, and I do. So I have table 1, really tiny down here. Oops. And if I click on table 6, of course I get 6. So we've got the state set up. The next thing I would imagine is we want to click one of these foods like pizza, and I actually want to sort of put the pizza into like a foods collection on the table. So let's just go back to, take this out of here for now. I'm going to take this tables collection to the top, just because eventually we're going to refactor some of these components out, and there'll be a little bit of this global state, unfortunately, left around. So now what I'm going to do is really not boring you by typing all the food. So I hope you don't mind, but I'm basically going to paste in the foods, just because I really don't want to type all this by hand, and you don't want to see me type this by hand, I'm sure. And the real change that we're going to make is, in addition to having some food objects to work with down here, is now the table needs to be able to sort of hold on to this food idea itself. So let's go down and just say foods is an empty array by default. And now we can imagine when somebody clicks on pizza, we can push the pizza object into this array, and we'll be able to track the state on that component. So that's the whole gist of that change. We're going to make one additional change here, which is before we do the on-click. This is where I'm not sure which is the right trade-off, but I basically don't want to go through and duplicate all the on-clicks at this point. So you saw me do it earlier. I created this links object in JavaScript just by iterating over the models. I can do the same thing here. So I'm going to say links is foods.map, and just basically loop over these. And food. And so before we actually attempt the on-click, we'll just kind of refactor this out, make sure it works. And bring this up. And we'll dynamically put in here, instead of all these hard-coded strings, say food.image URL, and then of course I have pizza, which could just be food.name, I think. Alright, and then down here, of course, all we have to do to use this new JavaScript object is just say links. It'll just basically iterate over all those LIs. Let's make sure we haven't broken anything yet. And we did, of course. And let's see, let's return this guy. Yeah.
So we need to take a parameter.
No, it's actually parameter free. Yep. So I feel like it's something I did up here. So I'm just double checking all the basic stuff I should have done. Remember when I said I was going to incrementally do this? So I didn't break all this stuff, okay. So it must be something, let me literally just take this dynamic stuff. Oops, let me just take this out for now and just kind of see if this is what we broke. And it must be because this URL did not have an LI. Yep. That probably wouldn't be good down there. I think we do need it right here. Good call. Look at that. From the audience. Thank you. Yeah, apparently you have to have that literally right under the script tag, otherwise people get very angry. So, okay, now I can remember what we're doing. We rewrote all of the food, right? So if I look at the food now, they're still showing up. And I believe I redid my undos. We'll just make sure all that's wired up. Okay, great. So I have my dynamic stuff, and the whole point of that, if you remember, was I'm going to add this on click, and I just didn't want to duplicate it. So how you add an on click in React is just simply on inline. So I can say on click is this dot. We'll create nothing called add food, and I'm going to bind it so I can use this, and I want the food.id as the parameter, and just to make sure we're keeping this locked down here. And I'll say add food, and of course now add food does take an ID, which is hopefully the food. And just to get really quick feedback on the console log the ID here, and we should be able to go right to the browser and see that when I click on this and I clear down here, I'm going to click pancakes. I think pancakes was number 2. So I got a 2. When I go to hot dog, I should go to 4, and I do. So we've got the on-click wired up to the bare minimum, which is we're just dumping out the ID, of course. So the next thing I want to do is just get the food itself, and then use kind of the same for loops, also foods for each, and I get my double equals right the first time here. Oh, I'm struggling up here. Okay. And I'll say if model.id is equal to the ID coming in here, then I'll say food equals model. And now we actually have the food, so I want to make sure we've got that wired up. So I'll console log out food.id, and if this for loop successfully runs, we should have a food. And then in addition, just to make sure I've got more than just the ID, I'm also going to log out the name of the food, which, to go back to this example, pizza. Yep, so down here, super tiny, I've got number 1 in pizza, I should get number 4 in hot dog. So I've got the right food, I've iterated that. All I need to do now, of course, is get the table and then push the food onto it. So we're going to do this in kind of 2 steps. The first step is I already have the table, so I can say table equals this.state.table. Because remember, we're sort of tracking that state in this component. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to console log down here, console log the table.food.length property. Because if you remember, the sort of acceptance criteria here is before we have no food, now I'm going to push a food onto it. And we're not showing anything in UI to show if this has happened. So all I'm going to do is sort of print it, and then we'll come back and actually show it in the UI. So what I need to do is say table.foods.push food. And if this is all working, I should be able to actually see down in the terminal here that I have a 0, I'm going to have a 1. And now I have a 1, I should have a 2. So we're definitely tracking. What's missing in the UI is right above this total. I have not dynamically gone through and just inserted an LI, basically. It's simple HTML stuff that we're missing. I'll take these console logs out because we have some confidence in that. So the next thing we do is just right here, and since it's dynamic, because imagine you come into this table the first time, you don't have any food selected, so we kind of want to do a dynamic setup here where one time we have the please select the food, and the other time we actually show the LIs with each food item. So I'm just going to create a variable here that says selected, because technically this will change, it will be dynamic. So up here a little ways, we'll create the selected variable. And we'll also pull out basically the foods. I'll just call them food models because we already have foods in the global scope, unfortunately. And to actually look at this, I have state. Remember, I have the table itself, and the table has foods. And the reason I'm pulling this out is I want to do an if statement that says if the food models.length is greater than 0, meaning we actually have some food in here, I want to say selected equals food models.map because we're going to create kind of a LI block in here. And I'll say return, and this is just going to be a really simple LI with an H3, and H3 has inside of it the food name. And then we're going to do a span to the right, and I have a special class name just called right that will float me over there. And then all I'm going to show on the right is the cost with a $sign in front, and the $sign is not like a program or anything, it's just physically a $sign that will show up in the browser, and I'll say item.cost. So really what I've done is created a new collection of LIs with H3s that'll show up down here. We do need the negative case, so I'll do an else statement where I just say selected equals, and we can just do like an H2 that says select some food. And now when I come back here, I should see, and I do select some food. And I would really love it if I clicked this, and it would just pop in there. It does not. But if you remember, we were console logging that there is a new item in that array. So why, if I'm watching this, is it not showing up? And this is sort of the biggest challenge for me as an Ember developer. And if anyone here does Angular or does Backbone with Stickit, two-way data binding, there is not two-way data binding here. That's effectively what's going wrong. So what I need to do, and I'm not sure if this is good or bad, but what I need to do in the add food to actually tell React to re-render that is say this.setState. and then I say, you know that table? Now it's this table. So love it or hate it, that is, in effect, what we need to do to get this to change, and now it works. Last thing, which is just a really simple JavaScript function, we have a $0 amount. But the best part about this component is we have a lot of stateful stuff now. We know the table, we know the foods. All we need to do is reduce and get the dollar amount. So I'm going to create a method here called getTotal. And all this is going to do is just return us the total, super simple stuff. So we'll say this.state.table.foods.reduce. We're basically going to start out with a function that gives me a total, and then the item, which is technically the food. We're going to start at 0. And then inside here, we'll basically return total plus item.cost. Now, the only thing we need to do to wire that JavaScript function up is basically find this $0 amount right here. We'll leave the $sign in front, again, just because we want it to look like dollars. And all we need to say is this.getTotal. I change this, I start adding stuff, the totals work. Fire up React.js. Part 1. Any questions on just that much? Which is like foundation, React Router. I should also say, Steph.
When you're mixing the HTML, DSL with JavaScript, how do you annotate different forms of escaping?
Escaping? Good question. I have not run into that. I mean, ultimately, if you're inside of the JSX stuff itself, it just gets translated into some kind of JavaScript function. So are you talking like inside of a string, or are you meaning mixing variables?
H3 item.name.
Oh, okay.
The user inserts a name that happens to have a script tag in it or something. Is this first one automatically escaped? And if so, is there a different syntax for opting into not-escape?
Yeah, I don't know.
I know.
Oh, check notes. Yes, check.
Escape. If you want to not have escape, we have a special method called dangerously set inner HTML.
All right, so
and then you have to say curly underscore HTML equals.
That's a sensible default. Okay.
Very ugly.
Awesome.
Cool. All right. I should also say, if you're interested in this and you're just like, Toran, you're going ridiculously fast, please stop. I have a full screencast of both part 1, which we just saw. It's on Vimeo out here. And then we're going to do part 2 in just a minute, which we're going to refactor it all to Billups, ES6, and kind of pull all this out of that inline index HTML. So if you guys want to check that out, I think this first one's 30 minutes long. The second one's like 15 minutes. So we are running up against some serious time constraints here. So we may just want to do the most appropriate thing, which is actually ask, who wants to see purely lazy loading and all that magic stuff, and who wants to see the Billups stuff? Because Billups kind of, it's a build tool anyway, it's not really prototype. So raise your hand if you love the talk at Midwest.js. No one, okay. So anybody, does anyone care if I skip the Billups stuff? That's what I should be asking. Because I'd like to skip the Billups and go right to JSPM. Let's do it? Okay, great, because we'll have plenty of time there. All right. And also the JSPM code is in a separate, if you're looking for the fire-up code, it's up there. The JSPM version is a little bit different because JSPM is also a build tool in itself. So you can use Go, but JSPM kind of traverses your requirements and builds your final JavaScript file for you. So that's why they're in separate repos, and there is quite a difference. But all right, we'll jump to the JSPM stuff and work on that just a bit. So I have the fully functional JSPM demo up here at 3,500, so we can close these ones here. And I think it's all functional yet, so it still works. And the only way I actually know if it's JSPM is if I look at the network tab. I have this build.js file, which effectively is a bunch of JSPM smashed down modules. It shouldn't be too foreign. It's all the same JavaScript we wrote. It's just sort of enclosed in a special function that takes care of all the module stuff. And JSPM, I should say, is still a very beta-like product. The whole point of JSPM is sort of twofold. It will traverse your requirements and build a single bundled-up file for you. And it can also sort of mask all the different JavaScript module formats and let you pull in common JS and ES6 and globals all in the same application, which is crazy. If you've ever gotten into the JavaScript module scene and you're like, well, this node project's all CommonJS, I'm writing ES6, which I've heard is the future, why can't they work together? JSPM is really just worth checking out on that point alone. But even more interesting than that, JSPM, and what I'm going to show in just a minute, is going to let me sort of hot swap and go fetch an entire module and pull it in on demand, load it, and use it. And then since it's all async, you can do this with I think UI router and Angular. Ember can use this, and then the React router, which is how we're going to do it. We'll already pull all that and use it. So first step is we're just going to declare the route itself because we don't actually have this dynamic route. So imagine that the foods order is one JavaScript code base, and your manager now needs some kind of reporting app that lets you do a bunch of transforms with D3. You probably want that in a separate repo for keeping your libraries and your code small. And so what we're going to do is the same idea here. So if I switch over to JSPM, I'm going to go to the router. And the only difference you're going to notice is because, I got to change this color. We got to go to Badger, right? There we go. Good color on that pan. Appreciate that. So now you guys can actually read this. Basically, this is the same code we had earlier. The only real difference is it's extracted out to a file called .jsx, and that's because we're basically going to transform this from the HTML-looking stuff to JavaScript, and that's kind of the step we skipped. And then secondly, at the top, you'll see I'm importing all of my dependencies. I'm importing my own, and I'm also importing the third-party React and React Router dependencies. So if I switch over here, the first step is inside the HTML, which is pretty familiar. I just need to actually add a link, just like we did previously. And I'm going to call it pre-reports. And the reason I'm calling it pre-reports is that what's going to happen is the link to here is going to traverse and actually find that I'm using the pre-reports module, and it's going to package it up. And the whole point of this exercise is I don't want all my JavaScript packaged up at the same time. So this pre-reports is going to be like a shim that just later goes and fetches reports when it's actually kicked off, sort of. So what we're going to say is link to pre-reports, and then just put a thing in here that says reports link. And first, I refresh the browser right now, a good router, and in fact, React Router will complain. It will say, hey, there is no route pre-reports. You've got to go create that before I render this app. So I'll switch back to the router, and we'll just drop another route in line down here. We'll call it pre-reports. Name equals pre-reports. And the path doesn't really matter because we're not using any dynamic stuff yet. We'll just call it reports. That's anything I want it to be. And then the most important part is the handler here. And the handler, we'll just call it pre-reports. Now, because I don't really care about the module stuff, and we're just trying to kind of show us, I'll inline it right now, call it pre-reports. And this is just a React.create class again. And then inside here, all we really need to start with is the render method, and we'll just start out by rendering that kind of like a hello world. So basic stuff. And let's first see if we've got that all wired up. Now, the one pain point as a live demo person is now that I actually have a build process, I have to drop out and actually run the build. So that's something I'm sure I'll forget at least once here. All right, so let's load this up. And I do have a reports link that I'm hovering over. It's kind of tiny. And you notice that the link has correctly wired me up to /reports. So what happens when I click this? It should just render what was inside there, which I had hello world. That's part of it. The network tab, of course, isn't going to do anything yet. So the whole point of this is, let's say I have over in the actual production code, I have this reports.jsx, and I really don't want to load this up because maybe it's an entire bundle of application, or it's just a really big module itself. I'll create it, it's called reports, and make sure we actually export it out because we're using ES6 now. So export to reports, and this is just a React.create class. This will just be really simple for now. We just have the render method in here, return an H2, something like that says in the reporting UI. And I expect that I only get this once I've hot loaded it, basically. And since we're actually doing full modules, I need to import React from React real quick. So now if I do a build, I don't have any errors, but I haven't actually used this. So the first step is, and this is where the magic comes in with JSPM, is when I actually hit the render method here, I'm going to sort of dynamically say, have I loaded that other module dynamically yet? And if I have, go ahead and load it up. If I have not, make that fetch using JSPM, which is the special weird syntax I'll show you. So we can do that in this lifecycle step called components did mount. Components did mount. And this is just, the only significance of component did mount is that I think it fires before render, and since this is some asynchronous code, we just want to kick that off as soon as we can. And what we're going to do is we're just going to basically say, I'm going to do a little self-hack, ignore that, and we'll say system.import. And the trick is, I actually want the compiled source. So I need what's living in the build directory right now. So I'll say build/reports. And then there's a special couple of chain methods I have to fire out. The first one with JSPM is I'm going to get back the ES6 module. And what I want to do for some reason in JSPM, when I get to this point, I actually don't have the living component. So what I have to do is actually return the ES6 module, and then whatever I've exported on it, if you're familiar with ES6, and maybe I can just flip back, you'll see at the bottom, export default. So I kind of have this default namespace, you can think, and if I want to actually access this, I need to return ES6 module default. Then I actually have the full component and the final callback here that I can do something with. And of course, if we're going to just do basic JavaScript stuff, I can go up here and set a property on the class called loaded component, something like that. Just a way for us to track if it's loaded yet or not. And then inside here, I can just say loaded component is component. And then a special little React method that says, don't worry about the lifecycle of this component, don't worry about diffing this virtual DOM thing, just re-render the entire method from scratch. And that is self.force update. And I should also put self on the front here. Okay. So now that's great, except in the render method right now, I'm still doing it H2. When I get to the render method, what I want to do is actually see, is the loaded component null? So I'm going to say component equals this.loaded component. And then what I want to do is actually return it, or I want to return this kind of pre-rendered HTML to kind of have a placeholder. So I'll do is say, if we have a component, return that component with all the properties that were passed into this, because imagine you can pass some state into this component, we want to pass those forward. Otherwise, I just want to return this pre-render is what we'll call it, which can just be any old JavaScript function. I'll just add it right here, pre-render, and all pre-render is going to do is return that really simple H2 that says, we're loading. So now when I actually hit this render method, it's going to go out and figure out, is the component loaded? It's probably in the middle of an async callback, so it's going to wait. Once I land in the second then and I force the update, render is called again. So we're going to put a couple console logs just to show that UI, just to see in the UI when it's going to work.
But return with the pre-render?
Yes, I did. Otherwise that won't work. Okay, return. And then we'll put a console log up here because there's also an interesting side effect that I found this morning. So we'll say component, get mount, pull, and got to use my build here. Alright, so now I'm going to go back just the root of this application. And the interesting thing we're going to watch this time is the network tab itself. So I'm going to watch the network tab, because remember the whole point is I click reports and it's going to dynamically fetch an ES6 module, right? That's exactly what it did. So on the right now, there was a kind of a brief pause that said loading, but then it popped in the recording UI, which is exactly what got hot loaded. And if you're asking Toran, there was a second HTTP request. This trace zero runtime is actually sort of an on-demand thing. It's basically the ES6 runtime, and if I'm loading the ES6 module, it comes with it, essentially fire out. You could actually return from this reports.js, you can return a common.js module, an AMD module, or ES6 module, and they all work together. So I also have some really cool examples where I literally have a common.js module that requires an AMD module, or requires an ES6 module, and they all work together, which just blows my mind. Because that is like the craziest fragmentation problem we face right now. So anyway, this was possibly the coolest thing, because one of the lessons learned in my career is that as I built bigger and bigger apps, we should stop doing that. We should build smaller apps. And one of the pain points in JavaScript, of course, is if I build many small apps, I can kind of simulate it here. How do I actually load them? And JSPM is just one of those answers. I think Webpack was another loader that was mentioned earlier today. I don't have any experience with Webpack, but JSPM is really cool. In fact, Guy, his name is Guy, so I don't know how to phrase this. The Guy, he's really cool to work with. He kind of toured and did
Mr. Bedford.
Mr. Bedford, yeah, exactly. He's just great to work with. In fact, when I was doing open source and kind of trying to help do some of this stuff, he was just immediate with feedback. I sort of felt bad, like I should have sent Storm a check or something, but of course, I just gave back to open source as best I could. So that is essentially talk 3, and we skipped to talk 2, but you kind of saw Grunt, and we saw Gulp and some ES6 stuff here as we drove out. Any questions over any of this at all?
The console log.
Okay, console log, good point. So I showed down here that the first time I come in and render, I basically showed that loading, and then when the component mount actually was called and called back, it forced the update, which made render happen again. Now this is what I left it in there, is if I hit the back button, I'm going to clear this out temporarily. If I hit the back button, and then I click reports again, I'm going to bring up the network tab and clear it. Do you think it will fetch that or not? Basically what I found is JSPM is smart enough to know, hey, I've already wrapped that module, don't go get it again. But what I didn't realize until I console logged it was I'm actually still calling component did mount and then doing that force render. So you could add a line of code and insert at the top that just says, if this is already loaded, just return. You don't do that force update noise. So. And all this is credited to Ryan Florence and Michael Jackson, of course, with following from the Ember router. So I've done nothing, I just literally demoed it and hopefully live coded it in a not so terrible way. But really cool project. In fact, it's really early days. They're trying to get some server-side rendering for this router, which I think would just be a distinct advantage for React over Ember at this point in time. So very cool stuff happening in that community. All right, that's all